My father fired me from the family business to give my job to my cousin. Then he needed the cardiologist I became. The nurse handed me the patient chart at 11:23 p.m., and I read the name twice before my hands started shaking. Robert Ashford, age 68, admitted through the emergency department 40 minutes ago with acute myocardial infarction. ST elevation pattern on EKG, troponin levels indicating significant cardiac damage. The patient was requesting me specifically as his cardiologist. I stood in the hallway of Mass General's cardiac unit, staring at my father's name on that chart, and felt something between rage and vindication flood through my chest. The same man who'd fired me from Ashford Industrial Supply 12 years ago, who'd called me a disappointment and given my position to my cousin Jeremy, was now lying in a hospital bed, asking for me to save his life. The nurse, a woman named Kelly Winters with 15 years in cardiac care, looked at me with concern. "Dr. Ashford, do you know this patient?" I knew him. God, I knew him. I'd been working at Ashford Industrial Supply for 6 years when my father fired me. The company had been in our family for 3 generations, started by my grandfather in 1952 as a small hardware supplier, grown by my father into a regional distributor with 43 employees and annual revenue of $8 million. I'd started there right out of college, a business degree from Boston University that I'd earned with decent grades and genuine enthusiasm for learning the family operation. My father, Robert Ashford, was a commanding presence, 6'2" with silver hair and a voice that filled rooms. He'd built the business through force of personality and relentless work ethic, and he expected everyone around him to match his intensity. I'd tried. I'd started in the warehouse, loading trucks and managing inventory, learning the operation from the ground up like my father had insisted. Then, I'd moved to sales, spending 3 years building relationships with contractors and construction companies, bringing in new accounts and maintaining existing ones. By year 6, I was operations manager, overseeing logistics and supply chain, making decisions that directly impacted profitability. I was good at it. The numbers proved that. We'd increased efficiency by 18% during my tenure, reduced waste by 22%, improved delivery times significantly. But my father had never been satisfied. There was always something wrong, some way I'd fallen short of his expectations. Deliveries were faster, but not fast enough. Efficiency was up, but margins could be better. I'd landed a major contract with a construction firm, but my father focused on the smaller account I'd lost the month before. Nothing I did was ever quite right, and after 6 years, I'd started to believe maybe he was correct. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I was disappointing him in ways I couldn't see. Then my cousin Jeremy got hired. Jeremy Ashford was my father's brother's son, 26 years old, charismatic and confident in a way I'd never been. He had an MBA from a decent school, had worked for a tech startup that had gone under, and needed a job. My uncle had asked my father to give Jeremy a chance, and my father had agreed enthusiastically. Too enthusiastically. Jeremy started as a sales associate, but within 3 months, he was sitting in on management meetings. Within 6 months, he was giving his opinions on strategy and operations, opinions my father seemed to value more than mine, despite Jeremy's limited experience with our actual business. I told myself it was nothing. Jeremy was family, my father was being supportive, it didn't threaten my position. But I felt the shift happening, subtle at first and then increasingly obvious. My father started directing questions to Jeremy instead of me during meetings. Started asking for Jeremy's input on decisions I would normally handle. Started praising Jeremy's ideas while dismissing mine. The morning my father fired me was a Wednesday in September, crisp and cold. I'd been called into his office at 8:45 a.m., assuming we were discussing the quarterly logistics review. Instead, my father sat behind his massive oak desk and told me he was making changes to the management structure. Jeremy would be taking over as operations manager effective immediately. I would be transitioning to a sales associate role, reporting to Jeremy. The demotion was presented as a lateral move, an opportunity to focus on what my father claimed I was better suited for, but we both knew what it was. I asked why. What had I done wrong? What had changed? My father's response was clinical and devastating. He said Jeremy brought fresh perspective and energy that the company needed, that Jeremy had innovative ideas about modernization and growth, that I'd been doing adequate work, but adequate wasn't enough to take the company to the next level. Adequate. 6 years of 60-hour weeks, of learning every aspect of the business, of tangible improvements to efficiency and profitability, reduced to adequate. I asked if this was really about performance, or if it was about favoritism. My father's expression hardened. He said if I was going to be disrespectful and question his judgment, perhaps I wasn't suited for any position at Ashford Industrial. The threat was clear. Accept the demotion or leave. I told him I'd think about it, and left his office feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, trying to process what had happened. By the time I got home that evening, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to accept a demotion, wasn't going to work for my younger cousin in a company I'd poured 6 years of my life into, wasn't going to watch my father groom Jeremy as his successor while I faded into irrelevance. I called my father that night and told him I was resigning. He didn't try to change my mind. He just said that was probably for the best, that maybe I'd find something I was better suited for outside the family business. The dismissiveness in his voice was worse than anger would have been. The next morning, I cleaned out my desk while the office was empty, leaving my keys and access badge on my father's desk with a brief resignation letter. I was 28 years old, unemployed, and completely unmoored from the future I'd been building toward for 6 years. My mother called me that afternoon, her voice tight with concern. She said my father had told her about my resignation, that she was sorry things had turned out this way. I asked if she'd known he was planning to demote me. She admitted she'd known he was considering giving Jeremy more responsibility, but she hadn't realized it would come at my expense. She said maybe this was an opportunity for me to find my own path, something I was passionate about, rather than something I'd inherited by birth. The suggestion felt like a platitude, but it stuck with me. What was I passionate about? Business operations at a supply company? Not really. I'd pursued it because it was expected, because the family business was supposed to be my legacy. But stripped of that expectation, what did I actually want? The answer came to me over the following weeks as I watched my younger brother struggle with severe asthma attacks. My brother Daniel was 24 and had suffered from respiratory issues his entire life. I'd spent countless hours in hospital waiting rooms with him and my mother, watching doctors manage his care, fascinated by their knowledge and the way they translated complex medical information into treatment plans. I'd always been good at science, had considered pre-med in college before my father convinced me business was the practical choice. Now, sitting in my brother's hospital room while a pulmonologist explained his treatment options, I felt something click into place. I wanted to be that person. The one with knowledge that mattered, skills that couldn't be dismissed as adequate or replaced by a charismatic cousin. Medicine was meritocracy in a way family business never could be. Your competence was measured objectively through exams, clinical performance, patient outcomes. Nobody could give your position to a relative because they liked them better. You either knew how to treat disease or you didn't. I started researching that night. Pre-med requirements, medical school admissions, timelines, costs. It was daunting. I'd need to complete prerequisite courses I'd skipped in college, ace the MCAT, apply to medical schools, endure 4 years of medical school plus residency. I'd be 37 or 38 before I could practice independently. But the alternative was finding another operations job somewhere, building someone else's business, always wondering if I'd walked away too easily from the challenge my father had posed. I enrolled in post-baccalaureate pre-med courses at Northeastern that January, taking organic chemistry, physics, biochemistry, while working part-time as a logistics consultant to pay bills. My mother was supportive in her careful way, saying she was proud I was pursuing something meaningful. Daniel was enthusiastically encouraging, excited his brother might become a doctor. My father's response when he heard was predictable. He called me 3 months into my coursework and said I was making a mistake, that I was too old to start medical school, that I was wasting time and money on a fantasy instead of finding real employment. He said medicine was oversaturated and highly competitive, that I'd never get into a decent school, that I was setting myself up for failure. I told him I'd take my chances and hung up. His skepticism became fuel. Every time I wanted to quit during those brutal prerequisite courses, every time organic chemistry problem sets made me question my sanity, I thought about my father's dismissive voice, saying I'd never make it. Spite is an underrated motivator. I finished my postbac with a 3.89 GPA. I took the MCAT and scored a 517. I applied to 15 medical schools and got interviews at 8. In March of 2014, I was accepted to Tufts University School of Medicine. Medical school was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and I'd spent 6 years managing supply chain logistics for a demanding father. The volume of information was overwhelming, the hours brutal, the pressure constant. But I loved it. For the first time in my life, I was pursuing something I'd chosen rather than inherited, something I was genuinely passionate about rather than obligated to continue. I gravitated toward cardiology during my clinical rotations. There was something appealing about the heart, the mechanics of it, the way cardiac disease could be diagnosed through systematic analysis and treated through evidence-based interventions. It reminded me of operations management in a strange way, systems thinking applied to human physiology. My cardiology rotation supervisor, Dr. Evelyn Park, 26 years in interventional cardiology, told me I had excellent clinical judgment and should seriously consider the specialty. I matched into an internal medicine residency at Mass General, one of the top programs in the country. The years blurred together after that. Residency, where I worked 100-hour weeks and learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. Fellowship in cardiology, where I specialized in interventional procedures and acute cardiac care. Board certifications. Finally, at age 39, I joined the cardiology faculty at Mass General as an attending physician. Through all of it, my relationship with my father remained fractured. We spoke maybe twice a year, brief uncomfortable phone calls on major holidays where my mother facilitated awkward conversations. He never acknowledged my medical school acceptance, never congratulated me on residency or fellowship, never showed interest in what I was doing. The few times I saw him at family gatherings, he'd make pointed comments about how long I'd been in training, how I was finally making real money at 39 after wasting my 20s and 30s on education. Meanwhile, Jeremy was thriving at Ashford Industrial Supply. My father talked about him constantly, glowing reports about how Jeremy had modernized operations, expanded into new markets, increased revenue by 35%. Jeremy was everything I hadn't been, dynamic, innovative, the son my father had always wanted. I told myself I didn't care. I'd built a career I was proud of, was helping patients, had skills that couldn't be taken away by familial favoritism. But it still hurt, hearing my father praise Jeremy for accomplishments in a business I'd once thought would be mine. My mother would call me separately after family events and apologize for my father's behavior. She'd say he was proud of me, even if he couldn't express it, that he'd told her privately that having a doctor in the family was impressive. But he'd never said it to me, and secondhand praise delivered by my mother felt hollow. The night my father was admitted to Mass General, I'd been on call for emergency cardiac cases. It was a Friday in November, cold and dark, the kind of night where the hospital felt like the only lit building in the world. I'd handled 2 cases already, a stent placement for a woman with unstable angina, and a consultation for a man with suspected myocarditis. I was reviewing labs in the cardiac unit when Kelly Winters approached me with that chart, telling me we had an acute MI patient requesting me specifically. I read the name, looked at the nurse, asked if there was any mistake about which Dr. Ashford the patient wanted. Kelly confirmed the patient had specifically asked for me by first name, had told the ER staff he was my father. I stood there holding that chart, my mind racing through implications. My father was having a heart attack, significant damage based on the troponin levels. He needed immediate intervention, likely catheterization to identify blockages and potentially stent placement or bypass surgery, depending on what we found. And he'd asked for me. The son he'd fired, the son he'd dismissed as inadequate, the son whose career choice he'd mocked. Now he needed that son's expertise to survive. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt professionally obligated. Whatever personal history existed between us, I was a physician, and he was a patient presenting with acute myocardial infarction. I had a duty of care that superseded family dynamics. I told Kelly I'd see him immediately and headed toward his room. My father was in bed 3 in the cardiac unit, monitors beeping steadily, oxygen cannula in his nose, IV lines running fluids and medications. He looked older than I remembered, grayer and more fragile. The commanding presence I associated with him had diminished, replaced by the vulnerability that comes with serious illness. He looked at me when I entered, his expression complex. Fear, relief, something that might have been regret. I introduced myself professionally, Dr. Ashford, attending cardiologist, and asked him to describe his symptoms. He'd had severe chest pain starting around 9:30 p.m., radiating to his left arm and jaw, shortness of breath, diaphoresis, classic presentation for acute MI. He'd driven himself to the hospital, which was spectacularly stupid but typical of my father's refusal to show weakness. I examined him, reviewed his EKG showing the ST segment elevation pattern indicating ongoing cardiac damage, and explained he needed immediate cardiac catheterization to visualize his coronary arteries and identify the blockage causing his heart attack. My father nodded, then said, "I asked for you specifically. I wanted you to know that." I kept my voice clinical. "I'm on call tonight. You would have gotten me regardless." "No. I asked the ER doctor if you worked here. When he said yes, I requested you. I wanted my son treating me." The word son landed strangely after 12 years of minimal contact. I asked why, given that he'd made clear years ago that he didn't value my judgment or abilities. My father looked away. "That was different. That was business. This is life and death. I trust you to keep me alive." The distinction was offensive. My work at his company had been dismissed as inadequate, but suddenly my medical judgment was trustworthy because his survival depended on it. I told him I'd review the catheterization findings and discuss treatment options afterward. Right now, we needed to move quickly to minimize further cardiac damage. I called for the cath lab team to prep and walked out before he could say anything else. Dr. Leonard Foster, chief of interventional cardiology with 32 years of experience, was supervising cases that night. He reviewed my father's case and agreed with the plan for immediate catheterization. We had him in the cath lab by 12:15 a.m. The procedure revealed what I'd suspected: severe blockage in the left anterior descending artery, the widowmaker location, 85% occlusion. He'd need a stent immediately to restore blood flow. I performed the placement under Dr. Foster's observation, threading the catheter through the femoral artery, navigating to the blockage, deploying the stent to hold the artery open. The procedure went smoothly, blood flow restored, heart rhythm stabilizing. My father would survive, though he'd need medications, lifestyle changes, and ongoing cardiac monitoring. When I went to his recovery room at 2:20 a.m. to explain the results, my mother was there. She looked exhausted and frightened, sitting in the chair beside his bed. She stood when I entered and hugged me, thanking me repeatedly for taking care of him. I explained the procedure results in language they could understand. Significant blockage. Stent placed successfully. He'd been minutes away from massive irreversible damage or death. He'd need blood thinners, statins, beta blockers, cardiac rehabilitation, smoking cessation if he was still smoking, diet changes, stress reduction, the standard protocol for post-MI management. My mother asked questions about recovery timeline and medication side effects. My father just stared at me with that same complex expression from earlier. When my mother left to call my brother with updates, my father finally spoke. "You saved my life tonight." I told him any competent cardiologist would have done the same intervention. The procedure was standard for this presentation. He said, "But it was you, my son, the one I fired 12 years ago." I didn't respond. He continued, his voice rough. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how I treated you, about the business." I said that was between him and his conscience, but right now his focus should be on recovery. He needed rest and shouldn't be having stressful conversations. My father ignored the deflection. "I was wrong. About firing you. About Jeremy. About all of it." The admission hung in the air between us. I asked what prompted this sudden insight. He said he'd had plenty of time to think while lying on that gurney waiting for a doctor, wondering if he'd die before they could treat him. Plenty of time to consider regrets. I told him people often make emotional declarations during medical crises that they don't mean in the cold light of day. He should focus on his physical recovery before worrying about apologizing for ancient history. "It's not ancient history to me," he said. "I think about it constantly, about how I treated you, about what happened after you left." I asked what happened. He said Jeremy ran Ashford Industrial into the ground. The expansion strategy that my father had praised so enthusiastically turned out to be overextension. Jeremy had taken on debt to fund rapid growth, had made acquisitions that didn't integrate well, had promised customers delivery schedules the company couldn't meet. Within 5 years, they were struggling. Within 8, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. My father had to sell the company last year to a competitor just to pay off the debt Jeremy had accumulated. 58 years of family business, 3 generations of work, gone because my father had trusted charisma over competence. Everything you'd built in operations, all the efficiency improvements, the systems you'd put in place, Jeremy dismantled it all, my father said. He thought he knew better. He didn't. "I should have listened to you. I should have valued what you brought to the company. Instead, I threw you away for someone flashier, and I lost everything because of it." I told him I was sorry he'd lost the business, but I couldn't pretend that validated my career change. I'd become a doctor because I wanted to be one, not as some long revenge plot against him. He said he knew that. He said he'd followed my career from a distance through my mother, knew when I'd gotten into medical school, when I'd matched at Mass General, when I'd completed fellowship. He'd been too proud to reach out, too embarrassed about how he'd treated me, too ashamed to admit he'd been wrong. "I told your mother that having a doctor in the family was impressive," he said. "She probably told you that." I confirmed she had. He said, "What I didn't tell her, what I couldn't say out loud, was that I was wrong about you. You weren't inadequate. You were never disappointing. I just couldn't see what I had because I was so focused on what I thought I wanted. And by the time I realized my mistake, you'd built a life without me. You became successful despite me, not because of me." Tonight, lying in that bed knowing I might die, all I could think was that I wanted my son. The one I'd pushed away. The one who'd proven me wrong about everything. The vulnerability in his voice was unfamiliar. My father had never been someone who admitted fault or showed weakness, but he was showing it now, and I didn't know what to do with it. I told him he needed rest, that we could talk more when he was stable. He reached out and grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd just had a heart attack. "Please don't leave without telling me you forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to know you don't hate me." I didn't hate him. Anger, yes. Resentment, certainly. But not hate. I told him I didn't hate him, that I'd made peace with what happened years ago. It had pushed me toward a career I loved, and I couldn't regret that even if the circumstances had been painful. He asked if I could ever forgive him for how he'd treated me, for choosing Jeremy over me, for not supporting my medical career, for wasting 12 years being too stubborn to apologize. I said forgiveness was complicated. What he'd done had hurt me deeply, had damaged our relationship in ways I wasn't sure could be fully repaired. But I also understood he'd made decisions he thought were right at the time, and he was clearly living with the consequences. Maybe that was enough. He squeezed my hand. "I want to try, to repair things, if you'll let me. I don't have the business anymore. I don't have much to offer except time and a genuine desire to know my son again. The real one, not the one I invented in my head who wasn't good enough." I told him we could talk about that once he was recovered and out of the hospital. Right now, he needed to sleep and let his heart heal. He finally released my hand and closed his eyes. I left the room and stood in the hallway feeling emotionally exhausted. Kelly Winters approached and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, just a complicated case. She said she'd figured out from the name that the patient was related to me, asked if I wanted someone else to take over his care given the personal connection. I considered it. It would be easier to hand my father off to another cardiologist and avoid the emotional entanglement. But something made me refuse. Maybe I wanted to see this through. Maybe I needed to prove to myself I could provide excellent care even for someone who'd hurt me. Maybe I wanted my father to see exactly what I'd become in the years since he'd dismissed me as inadequate. I told Kelly I'd continue as his attending physician. The next few days were medically straightforward, but emotionally complex. My father was stable, responding well to medications, showing no signs of complications from the stent placement. I saw him twice daily for medical rounds, checking his vitals, reviewing labs, adjusting medications, explaining his recovery plan. My mother was there constantly, and Daniel visited daily, grateful I was handling Dad's care. During those visits, my father tried repeatedly to have deeper conversations about our relationship and his regrets. I deflected most of them, maintaining professional boundaries. This wasn't therapy. He was my patient, and my job was medical care, not emotional reconciliation. But some conversations were unavoidable. On day 3, my father asked what it had been like going through medical school. I gave him the abbreviated version. Challenging, rewarding, transformative. He asked if I'd ever doubted my decision. I told him honestly that I doubted it frequently, especially during the hardest parts of training. But I'd never regretted it. He said, "I made you doubt yourself constantly when you worked for me. I'm sorry for that. You never should have questioned your own competence because I was too blind to recognize it." On day 4, he told me about selling Ashford Industrial, how painful it had been to watch the business his father and grandfather had built end under his watch, how he'd spent the past year dealing with that failure, that shame, how he'd realized too late that the son he'd fired would have prevented the disaster if he'd been there instead of Jeremy. I told him he couldn't know that, couldn't rewrite history with hypotheticals, but he insisted he knew, because in retrospect, he could see that I'd understood the business in ways Jeremy never had. On day 5, he was cleared for discharge. I reviewed his discharge instructions in detail. Medications, follow-up appointments, lifestyle modifications, warning signs that should prompt immediate return to emergency. Cardiac rehabilitation would start in 2 weeks. He'd need monitoring, but his prognosis was good if he complied with treatment. As I was finishing the discharge paperwork, my father said, "I've been thinking about what comes next. For me, I mean. I don't have the business anymore. I'm 68. I had a heart attack. I need to figure out what the rest of my life looks like." I said that was a question for him to work through, possibly with a therapist who specialized in life transitions and medical trauma. He said, "I want it to include you. I want to be part of your life again. I want to know my son, the doctor, the person you became when I wasn't paying attention." I told him that would take time, that rebuilding trust after 12 years wasn't instantaneous, but I was willing to try if he was genuine about changing the dynamics between us. He said he was. He said having a heart attack and nearly dying had clarified his priorities in a way nothing else could have. Family mattered. Real relationships mattered. The business he'd sacrificed everything for was gone, but his son was standing in front of him, having just saved his life, and that meant something. Over the following months, my father did something I never expected. He followed through. He attended every cardiac rehabilitation session. He took his medications religiously. He modified his diet and started exercising within his restrictions. He quit smoking after 40 years of denial about the health risks. And he reached out consistently, calling me weekly just to talk. Not about anything heavy, just normal conversations about his life and mine. He asked about my work, showed genuine interest in the cases I described, tried to understand what cardiology involved. He attended Daniel's birthday celebration and sat next to me, making an effort to act like a father rather than a stranger. He invited me to lunch once a month, casual meetings where we slowly rebuilt the connection that had fractured 12 years earlier. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension when old patterns tried to resurface, when he'd start to slip into criticism or I'd feel defensive about my choices. But we were both trying, and that mattered. 6 months after his heart attack, my father asked if he could attend one of my lectures. I was speaking at a cardiology conference about interventional techniques in acute MI management, and he wanted to watch. I was skeptical about whether he'd find it interesting or comprehensible, but I gave him the details. He showed up, sat in the back of the lecture hall, and watched me present to a room of 200 cardiologists and cardiac surgeons. Afterward, he waited while I talked with colleagues and answered questions. When the room had cleared, he approached me. His eyes were red. I asked if he was okay, if he was having cardiac symptoms. He said no, he was fine. He was just overwhelmed watching me present, seeing the respect other physicians showed me, understanding the expertise I'd developed. "That was you up there," he said. "My son, an expert in your field, teaching other doctors, saving lives. And I almost missed all of it because I was too stupid to see your potential when you worked for me." I told him he couldn't torment himself with regret forever. "What's done was done." He said, "I know, but I need you to understand something. When I fired you, I thought I was doing what was best for the business. I genuinely believed Jeremy was a better fit for operations manager. I was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but I believed it. What I'm realizing now is that even if I'd been right, even if Jeremy had been better for that specific role, it wouldn't have mattered. You were my son. I should have found a place for you, should have valued your contributions, should have supported your growth instead of pushing you out. The business is gone, but you're here, and that's what actually matters." The confession felt genuine. I told him I appreciated him saying it. He asked if I'd forgiven him. I said I was working on it, that forgiveness was a process rather than a single decision. He nodded and said that was fair, that he'd wait as long as I needed. A year after his heart attack, my father attended my brother Daniel's wedding. We sat at the family table, my parents and me, and my father made a toast. He talked about his sons, about Daniel starting a new chapter with his wife, about how proud he was of both his boys. Then he turned to me and said something I'd never expected to hear. I want to specifically acknowledge my oldest son, who I failed in ways I'm still trying to make right. 12 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I pushed away someone who was capable and dedicated because I couldn't see what I had. He didn't let that destroy him. He went to medical school, became a cardiologist, and built a career that saved countless lives, including mine. I'm grateful every day that he's generous enough to let me back into his life after how I treated him. To both my sons, you've become better men than I deserved. The toast was public and uncomfortable and completely sincere. Several people approached me afterward asking what my father had been referring to, and I gave vague answers about old family dynamics. But my mother pulled me aside later and said she was proud of both of us for working to repair our relationship. She said my father had been genuinely transformed by his heart attack, that he'd spent the past year evaluating his life and his priorities in ways he'd never done before. She said he talked about me constantly, telling anyone who'd listen that his son was a cardiologist at Mass General. The pride in his voice was real, she said, even if it had come a decade too late. I asked if she thought he'd really changed, or if this was temporary guilt that would fade. She said she thought it was real, that near-death experiences sometimes did change people fundamentally, forcing them to confront mortality and legacy. My father had lost his business and nearly lost his life. What he'd gained was perspective about what actually mattered. 2 years after the heart attack, my father had a follow-up catheterization to check his stent and evaluate his cardiac function. I performed the procedure personally. Everything looked good. The stent was patent, blood flow was excellent, his ejection fraction had returned to normal. He'd be on medications indefinitely, but his prognosis was excellent. When I told him the results, he thanked me not just for the procedure, but for everything over the past 2 years, for giving him a second chance at being my father. I told him I'd given him a second chance at life medically. The father relationship was still under construction. He laughed and said that was fair. He said he'd take whatever I was willing to give him and try to earn more. That year, my father did something unexpected. He established a scholarship at Tufts University School of Medicine for students pursuing cardiology. The Robert Ashford Cardiac Medicine Scholarship, funded by the proceeds from selling Ashford Industrial Supply. The scholarship would cover tuition for 2 students annually in perpetuity. When he told me about it, I asked why. He said, "Because I want something good to come from the business? It's gone, but the money from it can help people become doctors. People like you who might face obstacles or doubts. I'm funding it in my name, but it's really in honor of you, the son who became a cardiologist when I told him he'd fail." The gesture was significant and surprising. I told him I appreciated it, that it would help students who needed it. He said he hoped I'd serve on the scholarship selection committee, help identify candidates who showed the kind of determination I'd shown. I agreed. The scholarship was announced 3 months later, and my father insisted I attend the announcement event at Tufts. He gave a speech about the importance of supporting medical education, and particularly supporting students who were changing careers or pursuing medicine later in life, like his son had done. He introduced me to the audience as Dr. Michael Ashford, attending cardiologist at Mass General, and said I was the inspiration for the scholarship. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. After the event, the dean of Tufts Medical School, Dr. Helen Crawford, with 35 years in medical education, approached me and said my father had spoken about me at length during the planning process for the scholarship. She said it was clear he was trying to make amends for past mistakes, and the scholarship was his way of honoring what I'd accomplished despite his initial lack of support. I told her I appreciated that context. She said the school was grateful for the funding and asked if I'd consider giving an occasional lecture to medical students about my path to medicine. I said I'd be honored. 3 years after the heart attack, my father's health was stable. He attended my lectures when I invited him, came to hospital events as my guest, met my colleagues, and understood what I did professionally in a way he'd never tried to understand when I worked for him. We had dinner monthly, and the conversations had evolved from awkward rebuilding to genuine connection. He'd learned to ask about my life without offering unwanted advice. I'd learned to share aspects of my work without testing whether he'd be supportive. The relationship wasn't perfect. We still had moments of tension. Old patterns sometimes emerged. But we'd built something functional from the wreckage of what we'd had before. One evening over dinner, my father said something that felt like a final piece of closure. He said, "I've been thinking about the moment I fired you, about how I told you that you were adequate, but not excellent, that Jeremy would take the company to the next level. I want you to know something. You were never adequate. You were always excellent. I just couldn't see it because I was measuring you against some impossible standard I'd invented. Jeremy failed because he wasn't you. The company failed because I replaced competence with charisma. Every decision I made after you left was a step toward disaster. I know I've said I was wrong before, but I want to be specific. You were always enough. You were always what the company needed. I was the one who was inadequate. I was the disappointing one. I failed you as a father and as a boss. And I'm grateful beyond words that you became successful anyway, that you found something you love, that you saved my life both literally and figuratively by giving me a chance to know you again." I told him I appreciated him saying that. He asked if I'd forgiven him. I said yes, I had, though it had taken time. Forgiveness didn't erase the hurt or undo the damage, but it meant I wasn't carrying anger anymore. I'd built a life I loved, and while I wished the path had been different, I couldn't regret the destination. He said that was more than he deserved. I said probably, but I was giving it anyway because the alternative was staying angry forever, and that seemed exhausting. We both laughed. The tension that had existed between us for so long had finally dissipated, replaced by something that felt like genuine affection. 5 years after the heart attack, I got married. My father attended with my mother, and he gave a toast at the reception that made half the room cry. He talked about second chances, about how his son had given him one both as a patient and as a father, about how grateful he was to be there celebrating my happiness after years of distance, about how my wife was getting a remarkable man, something he'd failed to recognize when it mattered. The toast was gracious and emotional and completely unexpected from the man who'd once told me I was adequate at best. After the wedding, my father pulled me aside. He said, "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for saving my life that night. And thank you for letting me back into yours. I don't deserve either, but I'm grateful for both." I told him he'd earned his way back through consistent effort and genuine change. That wasn't easy, and I respected that he'd done the work. He said, "I spent 68 years building a business and lost it in 5 years because I made bad decisions. But I spent 5 years rebuilding a relationship with my son, and that's the only thing I've done that actually matters. Everything else was just noise. You're the real legacy, not some supply company. You're what I should have been proud of all along." Looking back now, 7 years after that night in the cardiac unit when I read my father's name on a patient chart, I can see how things have come full circle. The man who fired me, who told me I wasn't good enough for his company, who dismissed my career choice as a fantasy, ended up needing the expertise I developed after leaving his world. The vindication wasn't what I expected. It wasn't dramatic or satisfying in a revenge sense. It was just real life, messy and complex, where people make mistakes, and sometimes, if you're lucky, they recognize those mistakes and try to fix them. My father is 75 now. His cardiac function remains good. He takes his medications, follows up religiously, lives within his restrictions. We have lunch every other week. He's met several of my patients who I've mentioned in conversation, understands the work I do in a way that clearly means something to him. The business he spent his life building is gone, but the son he pushed away became something he never imagined. And in a strange way, both of us are better for it. I'm better because being forced out of the family business pushed me toward a career I genuinely love, something I probably wouldn't have pursued if I'd been comfortable at Ashford Industrial Supply. He's better because losing everything forced him to evaluate what actually mattered, to recognize that legacy isn't about business or money. It's about relationships and the people you leave behind. Sometimes I think about that September morning when he fired me, when he told me I was adequate but not excellent. If I could go back and tell my 28-year-old self what would happen next, I'd say, "You'll spend the next 12 years proving him wrong. You'll become excellent at something that matters. You'll save lives, including his. And eventually, you'll rebuild something with him that's more genuine than what you had before. It won't be easy, but it'll be worth it." The irony isn't lost on me that the position my father thought I wasn't good enough for doesn't exist anymore. Ashford Industrial Supply was sold off and dissolved. Jeremy's role, the one I'd been demoted for, the operations manager position that was supposedly the future of the company, is gone. But the career I built after being fired? That's thriving. The skills I developed? They saved my father's life and countless other patients. The choice I made after being told I wasn't adequate? It led to excellence he'd never imagined. I'm not grateful my father fired me. The pain of that rejection was real, and the years of distance hurt. But I'm grateful for what I became afterward. And I'm grateful he lived long enough to see it, to understand what he'd missed, to try to make amends. Not everyone gets that chance. Some relationships fracture and never heal. Some parents die without acknowledging their mistakes. Some sons never get to hear their fathers say they were wrong. I got lucky in that sense. My father survived his heart attack. He woke up to what mattered. He did the work to repair what he'd broken. And I was willing to let him try. That's the real story. Not that I became successful despite him, or that I refused to treat him out of revenge. The real story is that two imperfect people found a way to rebuild connection after it had been destroyed, that forgiveness is possible even after significant hurt, that it's never too late to acknowledge mistakes and try to do better. My father told me recently that having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to him, despite nearly killing him. I asked how he figured that. He said because it forced him to confront his mortality, his regrets, his failures. It gave him a reason to reach out to me when pride had kept him away for a decade. It made him evaluate what mattered while he still had time to fix it. Without that heart attack, he said, he probably would have died years later still estranged from me, still too stubborn to apologize, still believing he'd been right to fire me and promote Jeremy. The heart attack gave him a second chance at life and at being my father. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that loose brick while looking for Christmas decorations all those years ago when I first discovered that I needed a different path. Would I still be working at Ashford Industrial Supply, watching it slowly collapse under Jeremy's mismanagement? Would I be bitter and frustrated, trapped in a job I'd never wanted but felt obligated to continue? Would my father and I still be estranged, unable to bridge the gap his decision had created? I'll never know the answers to those questions. What I know is that the path I took, painful as it was, led me to something better than I'd imagined. A career that challenges and fulfills me. Skills that make a real difference. A relationship with my father that, while late in coming, is more genuine than what we had before. Sometimes being fired from the family business is the best thing that can happen to you. Sometimes the person who dismisses you as inadequate is the same person who'll need you desperately years later. Sometimes vindication isn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It's about proving yourself right, building something you're proud of, and being generous enough to help the person who hurt you when they need it most. My father needed me that night in the cardiac unit. Not the operations manager he'd fired. Not the disappointed son he'd pushed away. Not the person he'd thought I should be. He needed the cardiologist I'd become, the expert I'd developed into, the person I'd chosen to be despite his lack of support. And I helped him. Not because he deserved it based on our history, but because I'm a doctor and he was a patient, and that's what doctors do. We treat disease regardless of personal feelings. We save lives even when those lives belong to people who've hurt us. We honor our oath and our training above our resentments. That's the real vindication. Not that my father needed me, and I could have refused, but that my father needed me, and I helped him anyway, because I'd become someone who prioritizes patient care over personal grievances, someone who values professional excellence over emotional satisfaction, someone who can extend compassion even when it's difficult. That's what 12 years of medical training taught me. That's what being a cardiologist means. My father likes to tell people now that his son saved his life. He's right, but not in the way he means. I saved his life medically by placing a stent and providing excellent cardiac care. But he saved his own life by having the courage to apologize, to acknowledge his mistakes, to do the hard work of rebuilding our relationship. We saved each other in different ways. I gave him more years to live. He gave me the closure and acknowledgement I'd needed for a decade. We both got second chances. The business is gone. The family legacy my grandfather started and my father built doesn't exist anymore. But the actual legacy, the one that matters, is sitting here having lunch with me every other week. It's the scholarship helping medical students pursue cardiology. It's the relationship we rebuilt from ashes. It's the understanding that people can change, that mistakes can be acknowledged, that forgiveness is possible even after significant hurt. That's worth more than any business. My father knows that now. It took losing everything for him to learn it, but he learned it. And I'm glad he did. Glad we both survived long enough to figure out what actually matters. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.